the Intergalactic University's prestigious Department of Xenobiology, was supposed to be the pinnacle of academic achievement in known space. Students from 43 different civilizations competed for admission to study under the galaxy's most renowned scholars. The learning environment was carefully controlled, the faculty meticulously screened, and the curriculum designed to challenge the finest minds across multiple star systems. Nobody had warned them about Professor Kate Starling. Dean Flux Brightwater had thought he understood humans when he approved the university's first human faculty appointment. After all, his species, the aquatic Meridians, prided themselves on rational analysis and careful evaluation of alien psychology. His preliminary assessment suggested that humans were industrious, intelligent, and remarkably adaptable to academic environments. What he hadn't anticipated was walking into Advanced Xenobiology Lecture Hall 3 and finding Professor Starling teaching comparative anatomy while wearing a military-grade plasma sidearm on her hip. The sight of an armed academic had sent ripples of concern through the diverse student body. The Carillion students, whose species naturally possessed razor-sharp claws and armor plating, seemed oddly intimidated by the small human weapon. The Vexian delegation, typically confident in their technological superiority, had positioned themselves near the exits. Most disturbing of all, the Threxian representatives, whose poisonous nature made them apex predators on most worlds, appeared to be taking notes on Professor Starling's holster positioning. Dean Brightwater, announced Administrative Coordinator Tex Voidstorm, his electronic voice carrying undertones of diplomatic panic. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Flux adjusted his environmental suit, which allowed his aquatic physiology to function in the university's standard atmosphere. "What kind of situation, Coordinator?" "The kind where concerned parents from 12 different star systems are demanding explanations about why their offspring are being educated by an armed human." Through the transparent aluminum observation panel, they could see Professor Starling conducting what appeared to be a perfectly normal lecture on evolutionary adaptation patterns. She gestured enthusiastically at holographic displays, showing various alien anatomical structures, while students took careful notes. The only unusual element was the weapon clearly visible at her side. "Has she threatened anyone?" Flux asked. "Not exactly," Tex replied, his mechanical systems processing multiple data streams simultaneously. But when student Brix Nightfall asked why she carries a sidearm in class, her response was somewhat concerning. "What did she say?" "For emergencies like this conversation." The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for diplomatic incidents or natural disasters. "Coordinator Voidstorm," Flux said, "carefully. Perhaps we should speak with Professor Starling directly." They entered the lecture hall during a brief break between class sections. Professor Starling was organizing her teaching materials while students clustered in species-specific groups. Their conversations focused on topics that probably shouldn't include terms like tactical advantage and defensive positioning. "Professor Starling," Flux announced, his aquatic voice creating harmonic ripples through his translation device. "We need to discuss your classroom protocols." Kate looked up from her holographic lesson plans with the kind of smile that made predators nervous. "Dean Brightwater, Coordinator Voidstorm. Excellent timing. I was hoping someone from administration would stop by." "You were?" "Of course. I wanted to request additional safety equipment for the lab sessions." Tex's electronic systems produced what sounded suspiciously like a mechanical sigh. "Professor, we're actually here to discuss your current safety equipment. Specifically, the weapon you're carrying." "Oh, this?" Kate gestured to her sidearm with casual indifference. "Standard-issue human plasma pistol. Nothing too dramatic." "Professor Starling," Flux said, "university regulations clearly prohibit weapons in academic environments." "Do they?" "I read the faculty handbook quite thoroughly. Section 15, subsection 12 specifically addresses inappropriate materials in educational settings. It mentions hazardous chemicals, unshielded radiation sources, and unstable biological specimens. Nothing about personal defense equipment." The observation was technically accurate, which made it infinitely more disturbing. "Professor," Tex interjected, "the spirit of the regulation clearly intends to maintain peaceful academic environments." Kate's laugh was musical and somehow deeply unsettling. Coordinator, the spirit of human academic environments assumes that knowledge is worth defending, sometimes literally. She activated a holographic display showing her lesson plan for the day. Today's lecture covers predatory adaptation in hostile environments. We'll be examining how various species develop defensive mechanisms when faced with threats that could eliminate their entire civilization. The irony was not lost on either administrator. "Professor Starling," Flux said, "surely you don't expect to face mortal threats in a xenobiology classroom?" "Dean Brightwater, I've been teaching for 15 years across 7 different star systems. In that time, I've encountered 3 assassination attempts, 2 kidnapping efforts, 1 species that considered human professors to be delicacies, and a theological debate that turned into a small war." She paused to let that information settle into their various neural structures. "So, yes, I expect to face mortal threats. Not because I'm looking for trouble, but because trouble has a habit of finding human educators." Tex's electronic systems were producing increasingly urgent warning signals. "Professor, surely you're exaggerating these incidents." "Am I? Would you like to see the documentation?" The Rigelian incident is particularly well documented. Apparently, teaching evolutionary theory to a species that believes they were created perfect and unchanging is considered heretical enough to warrant planetary excommunication. She pulled up another holographic display showing what appeared to be official incident reports from multiple academic institutions. The Andromedan situation was more straightforward. Pirates decided that kidnapping a human professor would be an excellent way to extract ransom from Earth's government. They were mistaken. What happened? I educated them about the tactical disadvantages of holding human prisoners. The lesson took approximately 47 minutes and involved extensive use of improvised weapons constructed from laboratory equipment. Flux felt his aquatic nervous system producing stress hormones in quantities that probably violated several biological conservation laws. "Professor Starling, you're describing acts of violence during academic missions." "Dean, I'm describing acts of education during violent interruptions. There's a significant difference." She gestured to her sidearm again. "This weapon isn't for threatening students or intimidating colleagues. It's for those special moments when someone decides that academic freedom is negotiable." The lecture hall's doors opened as students began returning from their break. The diverse array of alien beings filled the space with chittering, harmonizing, and various other forms of interspecies communication. "Professor," Tex said urgently, "we should continue this discussion privately." "Why?" "The students should understand the safety protocols that govern their educational environment." Before either administrator could object, Kate addressed the assembled class. "Students, we've been discussing classroom safety procedures. Dean Brightwater and Coordinator Voidstorm have raised some questions about defensive equipment in academic settings." Student Brix Nightfall, a Kylestis whose translucent form rippled with curious patterns, raised a tentacled appendage. "Professor Starling, is the weapon actually necessary for xenobiology instruction?" "Excellent question, Student Nightfall. Let me answer with a practical example." She activated the holographic display system and brought up a tactical scenario that made both administrators wish they'd chosen different careers. 3 months ago, I was conducting field research on Kepler-7, studying the evolutionary adaptations of silicon-based life forms. The research was proceeding normally until a Carillion raiding party decided that my equipment would make excellent salvage. The holographic display showed a recreation of the incident, complete with topographical data and movement patterns. The raiders assumed that one human scientist would be easy prey. They were operating under the common misconception that humans are physically weak and tactically naive. Student Jex Flamewind, whose draconian physiology made him naturally interested in combat scenarios, leaned forward with obvious fascination. "What was your response, Professor?" "Educational," Kate replied with that terrifying smile. "I taught them about human resourcefulness, adaptive problem-solving, and the tactical applications of xenobiology knowledge." The holographic display showed the progression of the encounter. What had begun as a straightforward raid quickly devolved into something that looked more like an advanced military exercise. "You see, students, the thing about studying alien life forms is that you learn quite a lot about alien weaknesses. Carillion raiders, for instance, have excellent armor plating but poor peripheral vision due to their predatory evolution. The display highlighted tactical movements that suggested Professor Starling had turned academic knowledge into combat advantages. Furthermore, she continued, their pack-hunting instincts make them predictable in group combat situations. Once you understand their behavioral patterns, neutralizing multiple opponents becomes a matter of applied psychology. Flux's aquatic physiology was struggling to process the implications of what he was witnessing. Professor Starling, are you teaching xenobiology or military tactics? Both, obviously. The study of alien life necessarily includes understanding how different species respond to stress, threat, and tactical pressure. It's all interconnected. Student Jex Starwind, representing the highly logical geometric collective, raised a mathematical query appendage. Professor, what statistical probability would you assign to violent encounters during routine academic activities? Approximately 12%, Student Starwind, but that number increases significantly when you're conducting research in contested space or dealing with civilizations that have strong opinions about academic freedom. She pulled up another set of statistics that made Tex's electronic systems produce alarmed beeping sounds. Human academic institutions have been targeted by hostile forces in 63 separate incidents over the past 20 years. The success rate of these attacks drops to approximately 0 when faculty members are properly prepared for defensive action. And properly prepared includes carrying military weapons, Flux asked. Dean, properly prepared includes understanding that knowledge is valuable enough to kill for, and therefore valuable enough to die defending. The philosophical implications of that statement hung in the air like toxic gas. But more importantly, she continued, it includes making sure that anyone who wants to interfere with human education understands the costs involved. Student Pex Moonbeam, whose empathic species typically avoided conflict, asked a question that made everyone in the room unconsciously lean forward. Professor Starling, has anyone actually tried to harm your students? Kate's expression became genuinely warm, almost maternal. Once, Student Moonbeam. A group of zealot extremists decided that interspecies education was corrupting pure galactic culture. They attempted to disrupt one of my field courses by taking my students hostage. The lecture hall fell absolutely silent. What happened? Moonbeam whispered. I provided them with a very thorough education about the consequences of threatening human students. She activated another holographic display, this one showing what appeared to be official security footage from a rescue operation. The hostage situation lasted approximately 18 minutes. The extremists spent the first 15 minutes making demands and threatening my students. They spent the last 3 minutes receiving intensive instruction in human protective instincts. The footage showed movements too fast and coordinated to follow clearly, but the outcome was obvious. What had begun as a hostage situation had ended with rescued students and very subdued extremists. The interesting thing about human psychology, Kate explained, is that we have two completely different responses to threats. When someone threatens us personally, we can be quite reasonable about negotiating, compromising, or finding peaceful solutions. She gestured to her sidearm. But when someone threatens our students, our children, or anyone under our protection, we stop being reasonable and start being educational. Dean Brightwater felt his aquatic nervous system approaching complete failure. Professor Starling, you're describing a pattern of violence that exceeds anything in our safety protocols. Dean, I'm describing a pattern of education that has kept human students safe in increasingly dangerous academic environments. She looked around the lecture hall at her diverse collection of alien students. Every being in this room represents a different evolutionary path, a unique approach to survival, and a distinct perspective on existence. That knowledge is precious beyond measure. Her voice carried conviction that transcended species barriers. Some individuals and organizations view that diversity as a threat to their narrow worldviews. They would prefer that certain species remain ignorant, isolated, or extinct. The weapon at her side seemed to catch the lecture hall's lighting with deliberate emphasis. My job is to make sure that education continues, regardless of who objects to it. Sometimes that requires improvised chemistry lessons. Sometimes it involves applied physics demonstrations. And sometimes it necessitates intensive courses in human protective psychology. Student Nightfall's translucent form rippled with what might have been admiration or terror. Professor, are all human educators prepared for such intensive teaching situations? Kate's laugh filled the hall with implications that made apex predators nervous. Student Nightfall, human teachers don't just prepare for difficult students. We prepare for anyone who might interfere with the learning process. She began gathering her materials as the class period approached its end. For homework, I want each of you to research one historical example of knowledge preservation under hostile conditions. Focus on how different species have protected their educational institutions when faced with external threats. As students began filing out, their conversations carried terms like tactical pedagogy and defensive academics that probably shouldn't exist in university vocabularies. Professor Starling, Flux said as the hall emptied, we still need to resolve the weapon policy issue. Kate paused in her packing and looked at both administrators with an expression of infinite patience mixed with barely contained violence. Dean Brightwater, Coordinator Voidstorm, let me ask you a question. If someone tried to prevent your students from learning, how far would you go to protect their education? The question hung in the air like a philosophical weapon. Because I can tell you exactly how far humans will go. We'll go as far as necessary and then a little bit further, just to make sure the lesson is understood. She slung her equipment bag over her shoulder, the motion causing her sidearm to catch the light again. Class dismissed, gentlemen. But don't worry about the weapon policy. I have a feeling that after today's demonstration, you'll discover that armed faculty might actually be the safest option for everyone involved. As she walked toward the exit, her voice carried back to the stunned administrators. After all, the galaxy is full of people who think education is optional. It's my job to teach them otherwise. The door closed behind her, leaving Dean Brightwater and Coordinator Voidstorm to contemplate the uncomfortable realization that their university had just become a very different kind of educational institution. And somehow, that felt like exactly what they needed. 3 weeks after the weapon policy discussion, Dean Brightwater thought he'd reached an understanding with Professor Starling. The university had quietly updated its safety protocols to include defensive equipment for faculty in high-risk educational environments, and Kate had agreed to attend additional administrative meetings about her teaching methods. Everything seemed to be progressing toward peaceful academic coexistence. Then the Purification Coalition arrived. The emergency alert reached Brightwater's office at 0347 local time, jarring him from the meditative trance that his aquatic species used instead of sleep. Coordinator Voidstorm's electronic voice carried unprecedented levels of panic through the communication system. Dean, we have a situation at the university. Armed extremists have taken control of the main academic complex. They're demanding the immediate termination of all interspecies education programs. Flux activated his emergency protocols while his environmental suit compensated for the stress-induced changes in his aquatic chemistry. How many hostiles? Approximately 60 combatants from the coalition. They've sealed the buildings and are broadcasting demands for the surrender of all non-native faculty members. The Purification Coalition. Brightwater had heard of them, a radical organization that viewed interspecies cooperation as contamination of pure galactic culture. They'd been responsible for attacks on diplomatic installations, trade networks, and cultural exchange programs across 17 different star systems. What about the students and faculty? Unknown. The coalition isn't responding to communication attempts. They've jammed all standard frequencies and established a perimeter around the entire campus. Flux felt his aquatic nervous system producing emergency hormones in dangerous quantities. Have you contacted local security forces? That's the problem, Dean. The closest military response unit is 48 hours away. Campus security was overwhelmed in the first 10 minutes of the assault. The implications were devastating. Hundreds of students from dozens of different civilizations were trapped inside the academic complex with armed extremists who viewed their very existence as ideological threats. Sir, Voidstorm continued, there's something else. We've lost contact with Professor Starling. Lost contact how? Her transponder went dark approximately 15 minutes after the initial attack. She was conducting a late-night laboratory session with 12 students when the coalition seized the building. Brightwater's aquatic physiology struggled to process the horrifying possibilities. Kate's students represented 6 different species, including several that the Purification Coalition considered genetic contamination of pure galactic bloodlines. Coordinator, we need to establish communication with the attackers. Find out what they want, what they're willing to negotiate. Already attempted, sir. They've issued one statement. All interspecies education programs must be permanently terminated. All non-native faculty must be surrendered for purification processing. And all contaminated students must be separated from pure individuals. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the genocidal implications. How long before backup arrives? 48 hours minimum. The coalition chose their timing perfectly. They attacked during the intersystem transport cycle when most emergency response vessels are in transit between sectors. Flux activated his desk's holographic display, showing the campus layout and known positions of coalition forces. The situation looked hopeless. 60 trained extremists with military equipment against academic staff and students with no combat capabilities. Dean, Voidstorm said quietly, there's been one additional communication from inside the building. From the coalition? No, sir. From Professor Starling. Brightwater's aquatic heart rate spiked dangerously. What did she say? Class is in session. Please do not disturb. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications that transcended species barriers. Coordinator, Flux said slowly. Professor Starling has 12 students trapped with armed extremists who want to eliminate interspecies education through violence. Yes, sir. And her response was to inform us that class is in session. That's correct, Dean. Do you think she understands the severity of the situation? Voidstorm's electronic systems processed that question for several seconds before responding. Sir, I think Professor Starling understands the situation better than we do. 2 hours later, the first coalition transmission reached the administrative offices. The extremist spokesperson, a Carillion supremacist named Krex Purifang, appeared on the holographic display with the kind of fanatical confidence that made diplomats nervous. Academic administrators, he announced, his translator carrying overtones of religious fervor. The Purification Coalition has assumed control of this contaminated facility. We demand immediate compliance with our purification protocols. Brightwater activated his own transmission system. This is Dean Flux Brightwater. We're prepared to negotiate for the safe release of students and faculty. There will be no negotiations, Aquatic Deviant. The Coalition recognizes only 2 categories: pure galactic beings who accept our authority and contaminated individuals who require processing. What do you mean by processing? Krex's predatory smile revealed rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. Contaminated faculty will be terminated as examples to other institutions. Contaminated students will be separated from pure individuals and transported to purification facilities for genetic correction. The genocidal intent was now explicit. However, he continued, we are prepared to demonstrate mercy. Surrender the human professor immediately, and we will consider reducing the severity of punishments for other contaminated individuals. Human professor? The armed deviant who has been conducting contamination indoctrination in the xenobiology department. Our intelligence indicates she carries weapons in violation of academic protocols. Brightwater felt his aquatic chemistry approaching toxic levels. The professor you're referring to has 12 students with her. Incorrect. She had 12 students. Our forces have secured that section of the facility. The contaminated individuals are being prepared for processing. The transmission ended, leaving the administrative offices in stunned silence. Coordinator, Flux whispered. They have Professor Starling and her students. Dean, Voidstorm replied. I don't think that's accurate. What do you mean? Sir, I've been monitoring internal building communications. The Coalition's tactical frequencies have been unusual for the past 30 minutes. Voidstorm activated his analysis systems, displaying intercepted communication logs from the extremist forces inside the academic complex. At 0412, Coalition Team 7 reported successful breach of the xenobiology laboratory. At 0413, they reported contact with hostile forces. At 0415, Team 7 stopped reporting entirely. Hostile forces? Unknown. Coalition Command dispatched Team 12 to investigate. At 0427, Team 12 reported finding Team 7's equipment, but no personnel. At 0429, Team 12 also stopped reporting. Brightwater's aquatic nervous system was producing stress responses that probably violated several biological safety protocols. How many coalition teams have gone silent? 17, sir. Over the past 2 hours, coalition forces have systematically lost contact with any unit that approaches the xenobiology section of the building. What does their command element think is happening? That's where it gets interesting, Dean. Coalition leadership is convinced they're facing a coordinated military response from hidden security forces. Voidstorm displayed additional communication intercepts showing increasingly frantic reports from extremist commanders trying to understand how their overwhelming tactical advantage had somehow disappeared. They're requesting reinforcements, reporting encounters with advanced defensive systems, and expressing confusion about impossible tactical situations in the laboratory areas. Coordinator? How many personnel does Professor Starling have with her? 12 students, sir, representing 6 different species, enrolled in advanced xenobiology with emphasis on interspecies cooperation. Students, not soldiers, not security personnel. Students. Yes, sir. And they've somehow neutralized 17 teams of trained extremists? It appears so, Dean. The implications were staggering. Either the coalition was facing a military response team that had somehow materialized inside the building, or Professor Starling was conducting the most lethal educational experience in galactic history. Sir, Voidstorm continued, there's been another transmission from the xenobiology section. From Professor Starling? Yes, Dean. She's requesting additional laboratory supplies. Additional supplies? What kind of supplies? Chemistry equipment, biological specimens, and what she describes as teaching aids for advanced practical applications. Brightwater felt his aquatic consciousness approaching complete overload. She wants laboratory supplies while under siege by armed extremists? Apparently so, sir. She also mentions that her students are making excellent progress on their final projects. Final projects? According to the course syllabus, advanced xenobiology concludes with practical demonstrations of species-specific adaptation strategies under extreme environmental pressure. The awful truth began to crystallize in Brightwater's aquatic neural networks. Professor Starling wasn't being held hostage by the Coalition. She was using the Coalition as a teaching tool. 4 hours after the initial attack, the first Coalition forces began emerging from the academic complex. They moved with the careful, deliberate pace of beings who had experienced something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. The extremists who surrendered to campus security forces bore no visible injuries, but their psychological condition suggested severe trauma. Coalition medical personnel reported symptoms including acute anxiety, persistent trembling, and an unusual fixation on the phrase, educational experience. Krex Purifang's final transmission reached the administrative offices at 0847, 6 hours after his confident demands for unconditional surrender. Academic administrators, he said, his voice carrying none of its previous fanatical fervor, the Purification Coalition wishes to negotiate immediate withdrawal from this facility. I thought you didn't negotiate with contaminated institutions, Brightwater replied. Circumstances have changed. We are prepared to recognize the educational autonomy of this institution in exchange for safe passage off-world. What about your purification protocols? We have discovered that some forms of education are more dangerous than contamination. The transmission showed Krex's predatory features twisted into an expression of species-transcendent terror. The human professor has provided us with very thorough instruction regarding the practical applications of interspecies cooperation. We no longer believe that such education represents a threat to galactic purity. What exactly did she teach you? That knowledge can be weaponized more effectively than we previously understood. That students defending their education are more dangerous than soldiers defending their territory. And that humans consider academic freedom to be worth dying for. Krex paused, his translator struggling with concepts that violated coalition ideology. She also demonstrated that humans are remarkably creative when it comes to improvising educational materials from available resources. Apparently, extremist assault equipment makes excellent chemistry teaching aids. The coalition withdrawal began immediately, with surviving members requesting immediate transport to the furthest edges of known space. They departed with a new appreciation for academic freedom and a healthy respect for interspecies educational programs. Professor Starling emerged from the xenobiology laboratory at 0932, accompanied by 12 students who looked remarkably calm, considering they'd just survived a terrorist siege. She carried her usual equipment bag and wore her standard plasma sidearm, both apparently unused during the evening's educational activities. "Dean Brightwater," she said cheerfully, as she approached the administrative team. "I hope we didn't cause too much disruption. My students were in the middle of their final examinations when the coalition arrived." "Professor Starling," Flux managed, "what exactly happened in there?" "Nothing unusual. Advanced practical applications of xenobiology principles under field conditions. My students demonstrated excellent mastery of species-specific defensive adaptations." Student Brick's Nightfall, whose translucent form rippled with what might have been pride or terror, added, "Professor Starling taught us how different species can combine their natural abilities to create synergistic defensive capabilities." "Synergistic defensive capabilities?" "For example," Nightfall continued, "Carillion extremists have excellent armor plating but poor resistance to Vexian sonic disruptors. Threxian poison immunity makes them ideal for deploying chemical countermeasures, and humans possess remarkable tactical creativity when protecting their students." Student Jex Flamewind nodded enthusiastically. The professor explained that real-world application of theoretical knowledge requires adaptive problem-solving under pressure. The coalition provided excellent practical training scenarios. "You use trained extremists as training scenarios?" "Educational opportunities," Kate corrected gently. The coalition members were very helpful in demonstrating how different forms of prejudice can be overcome through intensive educational experiences. She gestured toward the departing extremist forces. "By the time we finished our final examinations, they had developed a much better understanding of interspecies cooperation and the value of academic diversity." "Professor," Coordinator Voidstorm asked, "did you actually harm any of the coalition members?" Coordinator: "Violence is never the goal of education. The goal is understanding. However, sometimes understanding requires very intensive practical demonstrations." Student Peck's Moonbeam's empathic sensors indicated overwhelming satisfaction. "Professor Starling showed us that knowledge can be the most powerful defensive tool when applied creatively and collaboratively." The coalition learned that trying to disrupt human education is significantly more dangerous than allowing it to continue, added student Jex Starwind. Kate began walking toward her office, her students following with the kind of loyalty typically reserved for pack leaders or religious figures. "Dean Brightwater," she called back, "I'll be filing a report on tonight's final examinations. My students performed excellently under extreme conditions, and I believe they've all earned top marks for practical application of xenobiological principles." "And the coalition?" "They've learned that academic freedom isn't just a philosophical concept. It's a practical necessity defended by beings who understand the value of education." Her voice carried back across the campus. "Class dismissed, Dean. But don't worry about future security threats. After tonight's demonstration, I suspect word will spread quickly that disrupting interspecies education at this university is a very poor career choice." As the academic complex returned to normal operations, Brightwater contemplated the uncomfortable realization that his university had become the safest educational institution in known space. Not because of advanced security systems or military protection, but because Professor Starling had turned the concept of armed teacher into something that made extremists prefer early retirement to educational disruption. The galaxy would never look at human educators the same way again. And somehow, that felt like exactly the lesson it needed to learn.